Have you ever been to San Francisco?
I had a friend who had GRS in San Francisco, and I spent like an entire week walking around the city. Golden Gate Park, Vista Del Mar. I even went over to Oakland. I don't know why I went over to Oakland, but I did. And then I went back to San Francisco.
I'm so jealous. I've always wanted to go to San Francisco. I've never been. Did you see like the normal sightseeing stuff, like Alcatraz?
I saw Alcatraz, but I didn't see much.
You didn't do like a tour?
No, I went to the Golden Gate Park and I walked the entire length of it and saw lots of art.
You're listening to Dot Femme.
Welcome to Dot Femme. I'm your host, Danielle Gonzalez.
I'm Claire.
Today we're talking about the riots at Compton's Cafeteria in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Claire, what do you know about the riots? Do you know anything?
Enough to know the broad strokes, but I think today we're going to explore the specific, is it called strokes? Details? Details.
Yeah. Well, I guess the best place to start is before the riots, what kind of led up to it. Compton's, it was a 24-hour cafeteria, part of a local chain in San Francisco. And this particular location was in the Tenderloin district. Multiple cities have Tenderloin districts. You know, it's one of those titles that cities have, like Skid Row, you know. A Tenderloin district is kind of like a red light district. They're usually kind of run and operated by the police. The police often, you know, in a Tenderloin district are pretty corrupt. They take kickbacks from prostitution and drugs and stuff going on there. Kind of seedy and dangerous places. This specific Tenderloin district in San Francisco was where the LGBT community was. It's been described as a gay ghetto by folks that used to live there.
Fun fact, it's on the corner of Turk and Taylor Street in San Francisco. And unfortunately, it looks like it is permanently closed.
Well, yeah, Compton's Cafeteria, I think that particular location went out of business in the late 70s, early 80s. It was redeveloped into more gentrified uses. I think the building itself is still there. Like, you can still see, like, the space and the windows, you know, that used to be the Comptons, but the actual cafeteria is gone.
There's a plaque on the ground out front of it, and it reads, 1966. One August evening in 1966, transgender women and gay men banded together to fight back against oppression after a police officer harassed one of them at Gene Compton's cafeteria. This confrontation was first known full-scale riot for transgender and gay rights in U.S. history. It galvanized the community, promoting new public policies and social services that improved the lives of local transgender people. That's pretty badass.
Yeah, you know, I think that particular event is considered like the first time that the fight for gay and especially trans rights really kind of went militant. You know, there had been demonstrations before by, like, you know, the Mattachine Society and Daughters of Bilitis, which I'm sure we'll talk about them in another episode, but those were a lot more what people think of when they think of like civil protest, picketing, lunch, like sit-ins and lunch strikes and stuff like that. But this was the first time that like an organization, a queer organization really like clashed with the police, you know. I think it's pretty important. It's been, you know, called, I don't know how widely used this term is, but it's been called the Stonewall of the West. It happened 3 years prior to Stonewall. Pretty major event. So you mentioned police harassment. And that was pretty common back then. Police kind of ran this district and they took kickbacks from all the prostitution and drug sales that were happening in the neighborhood. As such, Compton's kind of was a safe haven for not just trans women, but just queer folks in general. In fact, around that time, I think a couple years before the riot, there was a serial killer running around the Tenderloin district who, according to the police, quote, specialized in killing trans women.
What?
The community needed safe spaces.
Remember way back when I first moved to Seattle, I participated in lots of like clothing swaps. And, you know, they were always held at like community centers. A bunch of people, you know, would show up. It wasn't just like a bunch of people walking around a table, like getting clothes. It was a bunch of people walking around a table getting clothes and hanging out with like, you know, refreshments and like munchies and stuff like that. Like community safe spaces are, you know, incredibly important. And when they're pulled out from under you, like it can be incredibly detrimental to the culture, you know, of the area, of the community. That
it's not just culture, it's literal survival. For trans women, it was very difficult to find work. There was practically this caste system that had developed among the trans women, between the trans women that worked the street as sex workers, and then there were the trans women who were, you know, so-called professional female impersonators, who they got a job, you know, to be themselves. But for a lot of trans women, you couldn't do that, right? And it was very difficult to get any job. It was, you know, being trans was not protected. There were no legal protections. So you could be fired for being trans. You could be evicted for being trans. You could be turned away, you know, after a job interview because you were trans. And so a lot of these girls started working on the street. And when you do sex work, it is so vital to have a community that you can contact and communicate and collaborate with, especially like you think about these girls, you know, they put in their, let's call it a shift in the early evening, and let's say you're off work by like 3 a.m. It's important to connect with the other sex workers in your area to talk about, yeah, such and such is a dangerous client, don't work with him, or so and so is a safe client, it's okay. And it's how you survive that kind of work, that lifestyle. And so when you lose that gathering space, it's not just a blow to, you know, the culture and the local community, but to like individual survival. So there was a hotel on Turk Street, just up the street from Compton's, called the El Rosa Hotel. And I don't think it's still there, but on the side of the building that used to be the El Rosa, there's still, you know, those old-timey painted advertisements that like hotels would have on the side of their building?
Yeah, one was just discovered in Capitol Hill, believe it or not. It was for a little gym, I think it was. It was cute.
Yeah, so the building that used to be the El Rosa still has their advertisement. It's, you know, faded and worn, obviously, but it's still there. So you can still see the building that used to be the El Rosa Hotel. The El Rosa kind of turned into this wayward home for the girls that came to the Tenderloin district, the trans women. And Compton's became this great place to meet because it was all hours, it was centralized to the district, literally in like the center of the district. It was very popular for folks to come and gather and hang out there.
To be clear, Danny, they were the most beautiful trans women that anyone has ever seen.
Absolutely gorgeous.
And that is a quote from Amanda St. James.
Yeah, she was a very important person during this period of time, along with, you know, Alicia Brevard and Felicia Elizondo and Tamara Ching. You know, this was a time when quote unquote female impersonation was illegal, and the police ran rampant with this. I mean, it was such a broad interpretation that they arrested folks for wearing lipstick, wearing mascara, having your buttons on your shirt on the wrong side so that it was like a more of like a female blouse than a man's shirt, having your hair too long, like just insane reasons to arrest someone. And after the police arrested someone for like female impersonation, they would take them to the county jail, quote, the drunk tank, as Amanda St. James described it. And they would shave these women's heads. Or if you refused to let them shave your head, they just put you in solitary confinement, like literal torture. That's crazy.
Did you see that they're recently moving trans women into men's prison against the order of a judge?
It wouldn't shock me. This is a fight that has long been going on, and we're still in it. Thankfully, like, cross-dressing and female impersonation isn't illegal anymore, but the treatment is still similar. All of this, I think, begins to boil over in the community until, you know, 1966, which 1966, I think, it's an interesting time in history, the like fight for trans rights and gay rights, especially because this is at a time where there's, you have the civil rights movement happening across the country about, racial civil rights and all of that. And you have the hippie counterculture anti-war movement happening as well, which is already sort of pushing gender norms. That's kind of the movement where it started to be okay for like women to wear pants and men to grow their hair out real long.
It's free love, man.
Exactly.
Free love.
So you already have this movement that's pushing against the established gender norms, which, I think makes it easier for queer folks to jump in and be like, see, we're also pushing gender norms and that's okay. And then you have the civil rights movement, is really galvanizing communities to push back against government abuse and to say, I'm here and I won't be pushed around anymore, right?
Oh, yeah.
So 1966 is this interesting kind of confluence of events. And I think you get those two attitudes combined with the long-built frustration in the Tenderloin district against police corruption and overreach that it boils over one night. Oftentimes, the police would come in randomly and just harass gay men, trans women, physically and sexually. It starts to become this boiling pot ready to overflow.
All right, so let me paint you a picture. You're walking home, right? You've had a really rough night, and you're like, God, I don't want to go home yet. All I want to do is I want to just like go to Compton's Cafeteria, like hang out with the girls, like just enjoy the rest of the evening, and you find yourself, you're having a good time, right? You're laughing, you're jesting, and then all of a sudden these pigs walk in. What are you gonna do? Okay, well, shit, the pigs are here. Well, maybe if we just keep our heads down, like we don't look, everything's gonna be fine. And then one day, one of these guys comes over and starts harassing you out of the blue for no apparent reason. You've seen this time and time again. Different girls getting harassed by the people, some being dragged out by their hair. The cafeteria's getting sick of it too. There's all these things that are happening, and then all of a sudden, one day, you just say, you know what? Fuck it. Enough. I'm done with this. And you take your coffee and you throw it in the officer's face, and next thing you know,
That's exactly what happened. So, police officers come in, they start antagonizing this group of trans women, and one of them is finally, fed up. She's had it. And it's not just the police, right? Compton's, we talk about Compton's was a safe hangout, but it wasn't like necessarily pro-LGBT. They weren't necessarily supportive, they were tolerant. And, at this time, there's a gay civil rights action group that starts popping up called Vanguard. And they're a lot more militant, for lack of a better word. They're like more than just doing like picket signs and stuff. They're like really kind of demonstrating and like,
we like them.
Naturally, Compton's becomes sort of a meeting place for Vanguard. And management at Compton's really begins to feel like Vanguard is, they're uppity. Compton's doesn't really want them hanging around. They think that they're scaring off more desirable business. So they start implementing this service fee that they really only seem to charge queer folks for. And so it becomes pretty obviously transparent what they're doing.
This is an area, right, that services really low income people. And so there was no need to put a service fee forward. It was just clear targeted harassment, trying to push queer people out of this neighborhood. Because simultaneously, right, there's a booming industry, and the Tenderloin district is one of the few holds left on the city where, people can actually live in affordable housing. And so, as gentrification does, right, it pushes queer folks, people of color, and those who are disabled out of the neighborhood. And that's just not right? This was a safe space for them.
Exactly. So all of this builds and builds and builds, and you have this one night where the police come in like they've been doing, and they harass a group, and one of them is finally just, I can't do like this. I'm not doing this anymore. I deserve to be treated better, and I'm not going to stand for it. So she takes her cup of hot coffee and throws it in one of the cops' faces. And they grab her and start, arresting her and her friends and taking her to take her downtown. And, the rest of the restaurant just kind of erupts, goes up in arms and is like, hey, that's bullshit. You've pushed us too far. She doesn't deserve to be arrested, all this kind of stuff. That's when, this riot happens. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was only one night of riot.
I think so.
And it was mostly led by Vanguard, but it was really, this community of trans women and drag queens that really kind of pushed this event forward and really made a large and important demonstration, one that couldn't be ignored. After this event, there was a police, I don't know if he was a captain or just an officer, but Elliot Blackstone, cis het police officer, but he became a fierce advocate for the queer community. And so after this event, he really started working with Vanguard and, the citizens of the Tenderloin to really try and reform San Francisco Police Department, or at least, the contingent that, police the Tenderloin. It was the first big moment in trans history.
In modern history.
Well, yes, in modern history. And I think, it's right now with everything going on and our community being targeted, it's very difficult to find space for gratitude. Our community owes a lot to the Screaming Queens of Compton's. I think it's our elders, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, and, of course, the Screaming Queens, who have fought so hard for what little progress we've made in recent decades. But, I for one, am very grateful for the sacrifices that these elders made and the strength that they showed and all the fighting that they did. This episode of Dot Femme is supported by our Patreon, duh. I mean, come on, you think a tiny trans podcast like us would have sponsors? I wish. No, we're supported entirely by our listeners. We're kind of like PBS that way, only we're patreon.com/dotfemme. That's patreon.com/dotfemme. So, speaking of public activism and rallies and protests and whatnot, you want to tell us a little bit about the protest that you and I are putting together?
You mean the We Protect Us Trans Power Rally, Trans Week of Visibility, Stand Strong, Open Your Doors, Take in Red State Refugees, Our Rights and Liberties Will Not Be Stripped Away on Saturday, April 5th, 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at Cal Anderson Park?
Yeah, I guess that's the one.
Yep. Anyway, my friend Bree and I went down to a bunch of protests, and then we were unhappy with them and realized that it's a bunch of wonderful, well-meaning, old, white, liberal, Democrats whose only priority is getting Musk out of office. The fact that I have to say get Musk out of office should be enough problem on its own. That's what those protests are focused on, and they definitely need to be there, but trans people are currently under attack, and our IDs now are starting to get stripped away from us. Mm-hmm. So, as a trans person going down to these anti-Elon rallies, it's yeah, we're with you, but also we're afraid of genocide right now. So we got bigger problems. That's kind of what's happening. So I started a rally. I organized a protest. I kind of, like I usually do with these things, I kind of just let my passion get the best of me, and I do something before I think about it, and then I realize, shit, why did I do that?
Yep. I think it's interesting how, well, I guess interesting's not the right word. It's notable that people are really scared. Mm-hmm. And I think kind of to the point of paralysis, it's hard for people to actually act and do something.
Oh yeah.
And that's one of the things that I have also noticed about recent protests is that there's been a lot of the messaging is there, but it's almost like a chicken with its head cut off. There's not a really solid sense of organization and coordination. And I think that's due a lot to kind of the fear that we're experiencing right now. And people are just too scared to know what to do.
It depends on also the organization size and whatnot.
Well, sure. established nonprofits who've been around for like 10 or 20 years are going to be more experienced in organizing than like a student union. Sure. But
yeah. But also, like, there's a trick with it, too, because, like, larger nonprofits, can put on or can throw a hell of a party. But the problem is that, like, the issue with that is there are much more gatekeepers in place. There are more things to consider. There's higher risk, right? So there's a lot of these things that, like, it's difficult for a nonprofit who's already putting so much money into their own efforts, to then go and, like, separate themselves, organize a protest, and then push for all of these ideals that they have. And meanwhile, still continue the everyday activism that they're doing, day in and day out. For me, as like, I run the Seattle Voice Lab, and so I don't have the activism side of what I do, other than like in-session work. So I just felt like I had time, and I was like, I don't contribute to like boots on the ground activism except for going to the random protest. So I was like, I'm just going to do it myself. And I have all the organizational systems already set in place. I've got all the experience of running a large team. It was like, okay, let's just fucking do it. If there's nobody else that's going to do it, I'm going to do it. It feels like I'm actively doing something as opposed to just like sitting idle and, sitting scared.
Yeah. And that's the key, right? Like finding community and coming together is a way to like help fight that fear. But also I think, unifying our community is important. Oftentimes when looking at cycles of oppression in history, the winning strategy, the one that seems to stop the cycle is always one of unification and community, right? It's the people coming together to stand up and put a stop to it.
The more people that we have unified against like a common cause, right, the more power that our community has. And so, if we're all focused on like the red state refugee programs that are developing across the country, if we're all developing like a network of safe houses, that gets people connected in a way that hasn't been seen. Well, I don't know, Danny. When has it ever been seen in our community?
I think things like this have happened in the past. I don't think we've ever experienced a concerted and organized effort to erase us in this way before, but we've seen organized resistance in our community before. You mentioned being scared, and I think what also sort of intrigues me a little bit about that is people respond to fear in different ways, right?
Fight or freeze, baby. Fight, fright, or freeze. I can't say it. Oh my God, it's gone. Fight, flight, or freeze. Ha ha! Got it. Anyway, continue on. What were you saying?
When all of this started kicking off, I also was very scared. I remember some very emotional phone calls like with my parents, but for me, it was a lot less about freezing and more about like, I think you and I know each other well enough that I have this like come and take me attitude, right?
Hell,
like if someone's gonna try to strip my rights away from me, they have a fight on their hands, and they'll know that. There's I love this quote about Teddy Roosevelt when he died. Did you hear this? Have you heard this quote? When Teddy Roosevelt died, he died in his sleep, and someone said he died in his sleep because death knew if he took him awake, he'd have a fight on his hands.
Oh shit. Nice.
I try to live up to that. I think that's part of why, I do like the coaching work that I do, and why I started this podcast was to try and sort of fight back in my own way.
Nice. Did you see what happened today?
A lot of things happened today.
The Department of Education.
What about it?
He stripped the Department of Education's budget through executive order.
So, we knew that was coming.
So how are we going to educate the masses now, Danny?
You say that as if we have been educating the masses this entire time. As a society, we have not valued public education since the 80s.
All education will be privatized via podcast from henceforth.
I feel like that's a bad idea.
Yeah, you might be right. What were you saying about the 80s? That actually sounded really interesting.
Well, look, I don't know that this fits into the theme of our podcast, and I don't want to, get too wide of topic, but...
This is the aftermath of the podcast. This is where people already have, put 45 or 40 minutes into into listening, and then they're like, okay, I'm just in it for the long haul now, baby.
They put 15 minutes of listening into the main topic, and then it's us just saying nothing for the last 15 minutes.
And thank you, viewer. We really appreciate you.
Join our Patreon.
Yeah. Join Patreon.
No, I think that there is really good evidence, and I think there are a lot of political historians that would agree with me when I say that Ronald Reagan ruined everything. And that's where I was going with that. That's the end of that statement. If you want more details about that, go to a different podcast. That's not what we do here.
No, we don't talk about ex-presidents. We only talk about current presidents sometimes, and only through quips.
Mostly just because I'm not like a lawyer or a political historian, and I don't want to contribute to accidentally spreading misinformation.
That's fair.
But
yeah, that's fair.
I do feel pretty confident in saying that Ronald Reagan ruined everything.
Agreed. Anyway. That's the podcast, baby.
That's how we're going to end it, huh?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I guess we've been talking long enough. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. If you like this podcast, you can listen to more episodes on our website, dotfemmepodcast.com, as well as anywhere else that you listen to your podcasts. You can find us on Blue Sky as well as YouTube. If you want to support us so that we can continue to bring you this trans history content, please support us on our Patreon. So with that, thanks for joining. I'm Danny.
I'm Claire.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye!